Make sure I know how to drive this thing. So this really, from the point of view of publishing in the web, we really are at a very, very significant watershed moment right now. Publishing in general has moved massively to using the web and web technologies in lots and lots of ways, making really rich, complex, dynamic, effective publications. I'm not talking about only scholarly publications. I'm talking about publications of all sorts, education, etc. And at the same time, the web is being made ever more useful for publishing, even for complex publications. And when I tell people that the web is putting a particular attention on publications, a lot of people are surprised by that because they think, isn't that what the web has always been about? But no, not really. The web's been more about communication, commerce, connecting, documents, but it really hasn't focused on what professional publications require, professional complex publications. So that's really what's new, is this convergence of kind of publication, electronic publication standards embodied mostly by EPUB, as Todd said in his introduction, and web standards. So let me just quickly run through for you how this happened over the past couple of years. The initiative actually was inaugurated at a presentation at Books and Browsers in 2014 called Bridging the Web and Digital Publishing. And that led to an unofficial draft that was called EPUB Web, EPUB Plus Web, or EPUB-Web in June 2015. That led to a document on GitHub called Portable Web Documents for the Open Web Platform, which quickly gave way less than a month later to one that said Portable Web Publications for the Open Web Platform, to what is the current editor's draft, Web Publications for the Open Web Platform, which is a work in process. The reason I go through all that history is notice how the words are changing as we go through here, particularly the change from documents to publications, because the web's always been about documents. The web hasn't really been about full publications. And when we get to the end of that, and we even dropped the word portable, and now we're talking about web publications for the Open Web Open Web Platform, it's because we realize that we still don't even have a good definition of what is a web publication. A publication isn't the same as a document. A document can be a publication, but typically publications are much more than just a single document. But it's true that a bunch of stuff on the web might be a publication. So, what we mean is an arbitrarily extensive and complex collection of resources. So it's web pages, style sheets, fonts, images, media, scripts, all those things together that have an identity as a publication, that can be referenced as a publication, as an entity. And whether or how that's packaged is really a separate issue. So when we previously were talking about PWP, which we're talking about portable web publications, we now really are kind of dropping the word portable and really emphasizing packaged web publications. And the reason for that is that it's not just about the text. You've probably all seen this infographic from STM, Tech Trends Outlook of 2020. Obviously, you're not going to be able to see the detail, but incredibly rich assortment of stuff that STM publishing is about. Almost all of that depends on web technologies. So what the vision for this web publication is a single publication that is used both online and offline. The same document, it just exists in two different states. It's offline, whether it's packaged like an EPUB is, or it's cached, so it's in your device, even when you're offline, or when you've lost connection, or it's online, even if it's distributed, but all the essential pieces are linked together. So again, it constitutes a single thing with an identity, and it has a canonical URL that can lead you to either the online version or a packaged version, or both. It's the same thing. So where we're really going with this is, really, wouldn't it be great if there really isn't any difference between an online publication and an EPUB? And that started to worry people, particularly in the publishing side of the world, because it sounds like it's the end of EPUB. People were panicking about that. But actually, no. This is designed to reinforce EPUB and to perpetuate it. So really, we can't not have EPUB anymore. It's become essential as part of the global publishing ecosystem. It's, first of all, obviously the main way you think of it is it's the master format for e-reader systems, including tablets and phones, as well as dedicated e-readers. But it's a lot more than that. It's the basic format for the interchange of accessible content. In fact, NISO with DAISY has done a lot toward developing that. And DAISY, a few years ago, moved from a previous format to EPUB as the proper vehicle for distributing accessible content. Education, not as much for delivered products, but it's the platforms and the infrastructure that all the big educational publishers are using that are primarily built on the EPUB for Education profile. Macmillan, Pearson, HMH, McGraw-Hill, all of them are doing this, building their whole infrastructure on HTML, conforming to EPUB, and aligning with EPUB for Education. And it's not just for books. It's used for all kinds of publications, and it's a global standard. So anyway, just to dispel any worries that EPUB is going to go away, it won't, because it's firmly embedded in the publication environment. What we really wanted to avoid was the W3C developing this web publication or portable or packaged web publication spec separately from EPUB and then having two conflicting specs. That would have been a disaster for the industry to have competing specs for what is essentially the same thing. So what I've been advocating and predicting would happen is that we'll actually wind up with, in a sense, kind of a layered spec. We'll have a spec for web publications, and there will be a profile of that for a packaged web publication, and it can be packaged in a number of different ways. And then there will be a profile of that that'll be EPUB 4, the next generation of EPUB, which will be a type of packaged web publication. Why is that relevant? It's because supply chains, like the publication supply chain, requires more predictability, more accessibility, more archivability than publications in general, or that web publications in general might. So, for example, we want it to be packaged in a specific way so that all of our systems are interoperable and work with it, even if web publications can say, well, you could package it any way that the web enables you to package things, right? So that's why the IDPF, as Todd mentioned, was recently combined into the W3C. And W3C has just launched this initiative called Publishing at W3C, which really puts a major focus on publishing. This is a quote from Jeff Jaffe, who's the CEO. A lot of people think we'll get swallowed up in the W3C because it's all these big guns like Intel and Cisco, but what they've realized is that there's a tremendous amount of expertise in the publishing industry about how to create these rich, complex things. And they're particularly focused, notice I've highlighted, journals, education materials, scholarly publications. They want that knowledge and perspective in the W3C so that these standards develop in ways that are useful for these kinds of advanced publications. So how it's structured is that there's an EPUB 3 community group. That's a group that is free to anybody to join. There's no cost to joining a community group. And that's charged with maintaining EPUB 3, which is the current generation of EPUB. We're currently at EPUB 3.1. There are a bunch of satellite specs. There's an indexing spec. There's a dictionary spec, distributed object spec, scripted component spec, and EPUB for Education profile, that cluster of things is being maintained and advanced by the community group. There's a publishing business group in the W3C that's currently, I will say mostly but not exclusively, former IDPF members, but it's really open, and we're actually actively trying to recruit representatives from a much broader range of publications than were represented in the IDPF, because the IDPF was still focused primarily on books and largely on trade books. And so we want to get journal publishers in this organization. We want to get more education participation, although there's been pretty good education participation in the last couple of years. And the cost to joining a business group is about the same as IDPF dues. So, because one other big obstacle is to become a full member of the W3C is very expensive. So we wanted to make sure that we provided a vehicle for publishers that can't afford to become full members to still have a voice in the W3C at a reasonable cost, which is what the business group does, and at no cost to help maintain the standard that we're using right now. So that's what the community group is for. And then a publishing working group is almost formed. The charter is in the final adoption phase. I think it should be within the next, we hope within the next couple of weeks that the chartering of this working group will be final. And that's the group that will then be charged with creating the official recommendation for web publications, which will include EPUB 4. And by the way, in that charter, it specifically says EPUB 4 is part of the charter of that group. So we've taken great pains to make sure that that's recognized, that EPUB 4 is absolutely part of the picture, long term. One thing that's caused some confusion is that there was a special accommodation made to members of the IDPF at the transition to say that they could be transitional publishing industry members for 2 years at their current dues and also participate in the working group. They could still stay in the business group at the cost about the same. In fact, for some publishers, the costs are going to go down. For the publishing business group, for some, they'll go up. So, so in terms of this web environment, the web is continuing to evolve, but now it's going to have much more publishing feedback. So in terms of the basics, HTML obviously is totally fundamental today, and people still don't completely grasp that it's all about structure and functionality. It's not about presentation. That's what CSS is for. So HTML5 has semantics and can provide the basis for complex scholarly models. In fact, there is a separate community group called Scholarly HTML that's working on developing a profile of HTML for scholarly articles. It's a work in process. There's drafts available online. And by the way, all the things I'm talking about in this talk are listed at the end of my last 2 slides with links to where you can get more information about them. CSS, really quite enthusiastic, believe it or not, moving toward print quality rendering. So there's a couple of geeky things called grid and flexbox, but those are aspects of CSS that will allow us to execute much more complex layouts that we're used to being able to do in print that we can't yet do online or in an ebook. Some new font features, etc. Microsoft is actually working on a spec for table behavior, which is of high interest to people in our part of the world, so that we have interoperability for tables in HTML among browsers. So all of that is helping to make complex content able to be more renderable, and especially STM content. Another thing that's really fundamental is accessibility, and it's a really good example of why it's so important to combine EPUB and web standards. Because I mentioned before, EPUB is the recommended format by DAISY for interchange of accessible content. Well, what was published at the beginning of this year, along with the EPUB 3.1 specification, is EPUB Accessibility 1.0, and that's what is now considered the baseline for accessible publications. It's a baseline specification that is clear enough. In the past, it's been very foggy what exactly a publisher had to do to consider their publication to be properly accessible. this enables specific enough guidelines that there will be the ability to create certification. In fact, Benetech is working on developing a certification program, which will be out later this year, that'll certify accessibility for publications, and also to enable discovery of accessible features in an EPUB. So it's all based on the web accessibility recommendations that are already part of the web platform, but they're adding things that are specific to publications that those web accessibility standards didn't address. And the reason that it's called EPUB Accessibility 1.0, it's not part of EPUB 3.1, is that it's intended to be independent of any version of EPUB. It applies to EPUB 2, it applies to EPUB 3. Anything, it'll apply to EPUB 4. It's a general specification, not a specific version. So just to give you a little sense of what it includes, it enables you to characterize an EPUB as to how accessible is it. Does it just have the metadata about its accessibility features? Does it actually have the metadata plus it's got the web conformance and it conforms to the EPUB accessibility requirements? Or is it optimized? So for example, a Braille version of an EPUB isn't considered fully accessible because it can't be read by anybody on any system. It's for a specific system. But it'd be crazy to say that's inaccessible. It's designed for a specific purpose. So that's also a category of being compliant. And then there's metadata that is aligned with schema.org that enables you to talk about the access mode that your publication provides, whether it's textual, visual, auditory, or tactile, what kind of accessibility features it has, does it have any accessibility hazards, a human readable summary of its accessibility, and then what mode is sufficient to consume all the content. So for example, if a publication has text and images, and the images has alt text, then a textual mode is sufficient to consume that publication. So that's what that's about. And then web accessibility, really in two big areas, what's called WCAG, which are web content accessibility guidelines, widely adopted internationally, lots of documentation resources about this kind of accessibility. The next generation of WCAG is just beginning to be worked on. It's called Silver, and it'll take a few years for that to come out. And then WAIARIA is accessible rich internet applications. That adds semantics to content via the role attribute and the ARIA role attribute, or the ARIA attributes. And recently, the Digital Publishing Initiative has added a set of publishing-specific ARIA attributes as well. So for example, the web and HTML doesn't have the concept of a chapter, doesn't have the concept of a footnote. Those are not part of the inherent HTML semantics. HTML thinks in terms of sections and asides, etc. So this gives you a way to say, this is a chapter, this is a footnote, and of course assistive technology needs to know that. Another really important reason for this web-based standardization is for interoperability, and that's not just a matter of connecting documents, but also media, publications, and connecting the people that are working on these. So one thing that I think is really exciting that finally got published as a recommendation at the end of February are the web annotation specs, the open annotation specs. There's actually three recommendations. One's the data model, one's a vocabulary, one's a protocol. And what this does is provides interoperable data structures for annotations so that you can exchange annotations between systems. You can store annotations on an annotation server where they aren't necessarily stored with the publication or on the publication. They're stored independently. And you can put annotations on text, on images, on videos, etc., using the access and basically pointing mechanisms that are inherent to the media. So for video, for example, it's time-based selector. You say, this chunk of this video is what I'm annotating, or this chunk of a picture is what I'm annotating. By the way, I'll give a plug to a regular session that I've organized for tomorrow afternoon. That's Heather's company, Hypothesis, and another one that I'm going to be talking about in a minute. about open annotations. I think it's a really important development. I think publishers, when they realize what they can do with these open annotations, it's going to be really exciting. Really opens up a lot of possibilities. And there is now a project actually for the past year or so, year and a half, a project called Annotating All Knowledge. This is a coalition of 70 scholarly publishers, platforms, libraries, technology organizations, many of them probably the people you work for, to develop, to actually implement this kind of open annotation framework across all kinds of publications and organizations. Pilots are underway at JSTOR and at Archive and at eLife right now. Force 11 is providing the platform and hosting the working group for this, so stay tuned to that. I think that's going to be an important development. And then this is one that many people in our part of the world aren't yet too aware of. That's the other organization that I have in the session tomorrow afternoon, is the International Image Interoperability Framework. This actually blew me away when I found out about it, because I was totally unaware of this until last spring. And it has grown incredibly quickly. It's now includes over 600 national libraries, research institutions, museums, technology firms, aggregators, and projects. It really comes out of the cultural heritage and the library side of the business, not the publishing side of the business. And that they're creating APIs and creating interoperable services. So I need to go quickly here. But the image API gives you all kinds of things you can express about an image to make them interoperable. Presentation API, and then in the future, going to be working on audio and video and 3D. And then lastly, I want to stress that when we're talking about the web, people think, oh, it's about my website. Well, it's not just about your website. It's all the technologies involved in the web, the open web platform, and they're really making some of the biggest strides, not in rendering the content to the end user, but in the infrastructure upstream. And one thing that I think is really significant to this market is what's just about to happen in the journal business. By the way, I have no connection with or interest in any of these organizations I'm talking with. These are not commercials. But I think it's really a cool thing that I'm sure you're all familiar with Adapon, one of the major journal hosts, 40% of the world's peer-reviewed journals. The next release coming later this year from Adapon not only will have a Redium-based EPUB reader natively in their browser, which is a good thing, but the thing I think is so exciting is that their infrastructure will generate EPUBs automatically for anything that's submitted to Adapon according to its spec. If it's submitted as a PDF, it'll make a fixed layout EPUB, but if it's submitted as the usual NLM's JATS-based XML, that is the input to Adapon, their system will automatically generate an EPUB of those journal articles. So I was talking about this at the EPUB Summit in Brussels a few months ago, and one of the Adapon folks was there, and I was chatting with him, and I said, boy, this is fantastic, because there'll just be there'll be thousands of journal articles available as EPUBs. And he said, no, you're wrong. It's millions of journal articles available as EPUBs, potentially later this year. And the action required on the part of the publisher is simply checking the box saying, as on the Literatum platform, what outputs do you want? If you check EPUB, you'll get EPUB. Job done. This is something that was actually talked about in an earlier pre-meeting seminar, one of them this morning, that the University of California Press is working on. It's called Editoria. This is a free open ebook production, not ebook, a book production infrastructure being developed by the University of California Press, the California Digital Library, and the Collaborative Knowledge Foundation. And it's really fully integrated web-based authoring, editing, and typesetting workflow. Converts from Word to XML and HTML, full function EPUB and web-based visual editor with track changes, a book builder interface to manage all the components. It renders PDFs for print or for PDF-based digital delivery, based on CSS typesetting. All of this is free, all of this is open source, and it's all web-based. Really exciting thing. And then another one, these last two things I mentioned both came out of a whole bunch of Mellon grants that were granted a couple years ago. This one's called Manifold. It's from the University of Minnesota Press with CUNY Digital Scholarship Lab and a group called Cast Iron Coding. This is basically kind of monographs on steroids, providing an online reading and annotation, discussion, augmentation program or platform for monographs. It integrates with print workflows. It's all EPUB based. It enables dynamic discussion and augmentation of books, and adding things like audios and videos and spreadsheets and presentations, et cetera. And again, just like Editoria, this system, when finished, and both of these are in beta right now, but they're real, but they're not finished at this point. By the fall, I think both of them will be functional. Free, open sourced, and all web-based. So this is why standards are so important, is because it's those web standards that enable all this to happen and everybody to take advantage of them. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of resources for you, and I got another page of them too. So tons of places for you to check out if any of this is of interest to you. Thank you. Oh, question.
Okay.
I thought I took too much time.
Well, I don't know if there's time.
Sorry.
Okay, regarding educational content.
Yeah.
Now if we hear of OER, Open Educational Resources, which of course are web-based. So where do standards come in with that?
The standards are the technical standards underneath those publications. In other words, creating them as HTML, making them available through systems that use web services, that use HTTP, etc. It's all web-based. What makes them OER is that they're open access, but they're all available on the web. But because they're all available on the web, they're all done with web standards. That's not as much news to me as that the big commercial publishers are all going to web-based systems for delivering their content. You know, and it's not trivial to move from the kind of gigantic, elaborate, print-based workflows that these big textbook publishers have had for years to kind of flip those to a web-based model is pretty striking, and the fact that so many of the big ones, most of the big ones, are all doing it at the same time. Another one is Wiley. The NISO virtual conference, that was just last week, wasn't it? Had a presentation from Wiley about 2 weeks ago, I guess. Time is flying fast. That they're moving to an HTML-based model for HTML-based infrastructure for their journal workflow, which frankly shocks me because, you know, they've been wedded to Wiley ML, and most journal workflows are based on JATS. Now, of course, they're still going to have JATS as part of the picture, but they're not starting with JATS. They're starting with HTML and generating JATS instead of the other way around. Very interesting.
One textbook publisher you didn't mention.
Pardon me?
You didn't mention Cengage. So are they not doing it yet?
I cannot swear to whether they are or not. So, but I'm not saying they aren't. I just don't know.
I work for them, but I don't have anything to do with that, so I don't know.
Okay. Well, I'll tell you, Ken Brooks, who was at Cengage, is who's leading the charge at Macmillan Learning to do exactly this. Right. Any other questions? Okay, thanks a lot.